The neighborhood looked picture perfect. Rows of identical houses sat neatly side by side, their freshly painted exteriors gleaming under the afternoon sun. The kind of place you'd see in a brochure, promising peace, safety, and the perfect suburban life. Think you know how this story ends? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. I stepped out of the moving truck, taking in the familiar scent of freshly mowed grass and clean, crisp air. Felt like the ideal place to settle down, to begin again. New town, new start. As I made my way to the front door of my new house, I noticed how quiet it was. Not a dog barking, not a child playing. Just silence. Even the wind seemed to have taken the day off. I chalked it up to it being a weekday, but something about the stillness lingered in my mind, gnawing at the back of it like a quiet, unspoken thought. The door opened with a soft creak, and I stepped inside, feeling the cool rush of air conditioning hit my skin. The house smelled of new wood, fresh paint, and something else. There was a faint sweetness to the air, like flowers, except the flowers weren't blooming. It was odd, but I didn't think too much about it. Just the newness of it all, I figured. I set my bags down in the hallway, the floors creaking slightly underfoot. The place looked immaculate, too immaculate, almost. The walls were white, the floors were gleaming, and everything was perfectly in place, as if no one had ever lived here before. But that wasn't true, was it? I hadn't been the first to step through these doors. I shrugged off the thought and headed into the kitchen. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the otherwise silent house. I opened the refrigerator, but it was nearly empty. Just a few bottles of water and some takeout containers from the previous owner. I was about to close the door when I heard something. A faint creak from somewhere upstairs. I paused, listening. Nothing. Probably just the house settling. I told myself that. It was an old house, after all, built sometime in the late 70s. I turned back to the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and headed for the living room. The silence returned. It was thick, almost like the air itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling of unease that was creeping up my spine, but it didn't go away. The feeling of being watched. I set the water bottle down on the coffee table and looked around the room. Everything was so neat, so clean. I couldn't help but notice the windows. The curtains were all drawn, the rooms hidden in shadow. In a house that was supposed to be full of sunlight, it felt a little too dark. A knock at the door broke the silence. I hesitated for a moment before going to answer it. When I opened the door, a middle-aged man stood there, smiling wide. His handshake was firm, his eyes steady, but something about him felt forced, like he was trying too hard to be friendly. "Hi, I'm Steve. I live across the street. Welcome to the neighborhood," he said. His voice warm but with an undertone that made me uncomfortable. I nodded, offering a smile in return. "Thanks. It's good to be here." He studied me for a moment, his eyes lingering too long, as if he was looking for something, trying to figure me out. Then he quickly shifted his gaze, glancing over his shoulder as if checking that no one else was around. "We're having a little barbecue on Saturday if you'd like to come. Meet the neighbors." He didn't wait for me to answer. "I'll let you get settled. Don't want to keep you." His smile lingered, but it didn't reach his eyes. I nodded again, closing the door softly behind him. The moment I turned away, I felt a weird shift in the air, like something had just happened, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I shook it off, reminding myself that it was just a neighborhood get-together. But Steve's smile, and the way he looked at me, stuck with me. I walked to the window, peering out from behind the curtains. Across the street, Steve stood in his yard, talking to someone I couldn't see. And then, just as I was about to pull back, I caught a glimpse, a shadow moving behind one of his curtains. It was quick, just a flash, but it left me feeling like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I tried to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks, but the feeling of unease remained. Something wasn't right here. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun had barely started to rise, casting long shadows across the empty streets of my new neighborhood. It was eerily quiet, even more so than before. As I unpacked boxes and settled in, I thought back to my conversation with Steve the day before. The barbecue invitation lingered in my mind, but there was something about the way he'd spoken that made me uncomfortable. I brushed it off, though. Maybe I was just overthinking things. By mid-morning, I decided to head over to the local convenience store just to get a feel for the area. As I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the lack of activity. No kids riding bikes, no elderly neighbors sitting on their porches. Just the sound of my footsteps echoing down the street. I arrived at the store, greeted by the familiar jingle of the doorbell. The inside was small, but it had everything I needed. The shelves were neatly stocked, and the aisles were practically empty. Felt like I was the only customer. A strange sensation crept up my spine, but I shook it off. As I approached the counter to pay, the woman behind the register smiled, though her eyes seemed distant. She scanned my items slowly, her movements deliberate, almost methodical. Then she spoke. "You new to the neighborhood?" she asked, her voice soft but cold. "Yeah, just moved in yesterday," I replied, trying to sound casual. She nodded. "Nice. You'll find it's a quiet place. People here value privacy, you know. Very private." I gave her a nod, unsure of how to respond. "By the way," she continued, leaning closer, "there are a few rules around here. Things you should know. They're important, really. Don't break them." My curiosity piqued. I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of rules?" She paused, her gaze flicking around the room before settling back on me. "Well, first off, always check the security cameras at the front of your house before you leave. Every time. It's for your safety. The neighborhood is safe, but it's best to be cautious." I nodded slowly. "All right, makes sense. And don't ever leave your windows open at night," she added. "Keep them locked. You don't know who might be watching. Some people, well, they can't be trusted." I couldn't help but feel a knot tightening in my stomach. This was all a little strange, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Okay, I'll keep that in mind." She handed me my change and smiled again. But this time, it felt more forced. "And one more thing. Don't ask too many questions about the neighbors. It's better if you just leave things be. Everyone here has their own way of doing things. Stick to your own business. That's how it works around here." Her words left me feeling unsettled, but I tried to push the discomfort aside. I took my bags and left the store, the weight of her warning still hanging in the air. The whole exchange had felt too rehearsed, too practiced, as if she'd said those exact words to every new person who moved into the neighborhood. On my walk back, I noticed the same stillness. The streets were empty, and the houses all looked the same. No movement, no noise. When I reached my house, I did what the woman had suggested. I checked the security cameras outside my house. Everything seemed fine, but then I felt a strange pressure in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just paranoia. It was probably the newness of the place, the unfamiliarity. But as I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, something about the whole situation didn't sit right. Later that evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to meet some of the neighbors. I kept my eyes peeled for anyone walking around, but the streets remained eerily quiet. I passed a few houses, all of which had their windows closed, blinds drawn. There were no porch lights on, no movement behind any of the windows. It felt like a ghost town, despite the houses being full of life just the day before. As I walked, I spotted a man standing in his driveway, staring at the ground. He was dressed in a loose, faded shirt and jeans, his hands in his pockets. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though the sun had already set. There was something off about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I gave him a polite wave as I walked past, but he didn't respond. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how odd it was. Every time I had seen someone in this neighborhood, they were either inside their homes or out in the yard, always in a way that felt controlled, like they were following an unspoken routine. There were no spontaneous chats, no neighborly greetings, just stiff, mechanical interactions. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window into the dark. I couldn't help but think about what the woman at the store had said. "Stick to your own business," she'd warned. "Don't ask too many questions." Felt like a warning, not just advice. I grabbed a notebook and began jotting down my thoughts, trying to make sense of it all. The rules were simple, practical even. But why did everyone take them so seriously? They were more than just suggestions. There was an underlying weight to them. Like they weren't just rules, they were expectations, and breaking them might have consequences. As I scribbled, I heard the faintest noise, like a door creaking open, followed by hushed whispers. The house next door. I froze. The whispers grew louder, but I couldn't make out the words. I stood up and went to the window, peeking out from behind the blinds. Nothing. I shook my head. Just the wind. Or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But the unease continued to grow, deepening as the night stretched on. The days that followed felt like they were slipping away, each one blurring into the next. I tried to keep a low profile, focusing on settling in and finding my rhythm in the neighborhood. Despite the unsettling warnings from the woman at the convenience store and the strange rules I'd heard about, I tried to convince myself it was all just part of the normality of a small, tight-knit community. But each time I turned my key in the lock, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things. A door that I was certain had been locked was now ajar. I'd find my curtains drawn back when I was sure I'd left them closed. It was like the house had a life of its own. At first, I convinced myself that I was just imagining things. I was tired from moving and trying to settle in. Maybe it was just the unfamiliarity of everything that had my nerves on edge. But when it started happening more frequently, I couldn't ignore it anymore. One morning, I came downstairs to find my front door wide open. I froze in the doorway, my heart racing. I was sure I'd locked it the night before, but there it was, open. Not just ajar, but wide enough that I could see the empty street outside. The neighborhood, as usual, was silent. No one in sight. I quickly checked the lock on the door. It hadn't been tampered with, and everything seemed in order. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. As I walked to the kitchen to grab some coffee, I noticed the flickering of the light overhead. It wasn't constant, but it flashed on and off in a slow rhythm, like the light bulb was struggling to stay lit. I tried to ignore it, reaching for the switch to turn it off. But before I could, it flickered again, brighter this time. A sound followed, soft and distant. A tapping, almost like a whisper in the air. My eyes darted to the door, to the windows. No one was there. I gripped the counter, trying to steady my racing pulse. I told myself it was the old wiring in the house, or maybe the neighbor's house had a problem with their power lines. It was a stretch, but it was all I had to hold on to. A few days later, things took an even stranger turn. I was at the local diner, grabbing lunch when I overheard a conversation between two of the regulars sitting at the counter. They were talking about the neighborhood in a way that made me uneasy. "It's not like it used to be," one of them said in a hushed voice, almost too quiet to hear. "People don't stay long anymore." You ever notice that? His companion nodded. I noticed. Every time someone new moves in, they never last. Something about this place. Something's not right. I tried not to listen, but their words lingered in my mind as I finished my meal. I didn't ask them about it. I couldn't, not after everything that had already happened. Later that evening, as I was reviewing some files I'd brought home from work, I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. I wasn't a night owl, but something kept me up. That feeling of being watched, of being drawn to check on things I didn't understand. I heard the same soft tapping sound again, distant but growing louder. This time it was coming from upstairs, just above me. I stood up slowly, holding my breath. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. The tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I reached for the doorknob to my bedroom and paused. Something didn't feel right. With a deep breath, I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps barely making a sound as I crept upstairs. Every shadow in the house seemed to shift around me, stretching and pulling in ways that didn't make sense. I finally reached the top of the stairs and stood in front of the door to the room where I kept my things. The sound had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. I pushed the door open slowly. Nothing. The room was as it had always been, neat and untouched. Yet the sense of wrongness lingered. I couldn't explain it. It was like the walls themselves were pressing in on me, closing me in, but I couldn't leave. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the stillness pressing on me from all sides. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of doubts and questions, none of which I could answer. Was I imagining things? Or was there really something wrong with this place? The next morning, I went to the hospital to work, hoping to escape the oddities of my home, even if only for a few hours. But when I checked the patient roster, something caught my eye. One name stood out, Jacob Carter. I'd never seen that name before, but there it was, listed as a patient in room 312. I double-checked the list. Jacob Carter. Same name, same room number. I asked a nurse passing by if she knew who he was. She glanced at the list, then at me, confusion flickering in her eyes. "That name's not on the list," she said, voice low. "We don't have a Jacob Carter here." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I looked at the list again. There it was, clear as day. Yet the nurse insisted it didn't exist. I tried to brush it off, but it gnawed at me. Later that night, I checked again. Jacob Carter's name was gone. Things continued to escalate. The strange occurrences at my house became more frequent. Doors I was sure I had locked were now open. The whispers grew louder at night, seeming to come from all directions. And the tapping, it never stopped. It was almost as if the house itself was trying to communicate with me, trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. I began to wonder if it was just me, if I was losing my mind. But then, one night, I saw something that made all of my doubts vanish. Through the window of the house next door, I saw Steve standing in his driveway again, just like before. Only this time he wasn't alone. There were others, figures standing in the shadows, their faces obscured, watching the house. It wasn't the usual quiet gaze. It was something more deliberate. I quickly stepped away from the window, my breath shallow and quick. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong with this neighborhood, and I was beginning to fear that I had stumbled into something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The whispers had become louder, the tapping more persistent, until it was almost deafening. Each night, I lay in bed, clutching the covers tightly, trying to ignore the chill that crept into the corners of the room. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I had to know the truth. I had to figure out what was happening before it consumed me. But the more I searched for answers, the more I realized that every question only led to more confusion. The neighbors were odd, but I had seen them around, and their behaviors, though strange, weren't out of the ordinary for a small town. But there was one person in particular who haunted my thoughts. Steve, the man next door. Something about him didn't sit right with me. Every time I saw him, it was as though he knew something I didn't. And now, with the neighbors standing in the shadows, watching in complete silence, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to confront him. I decided to go next door, to knock on his door and demand an explanation for what was going on. Maybe it was irrational, maybe it was reckless, but it was the only thing I could think of to stop this unease that had been growing inside me. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the cold night. The sky was overcast, and the wind carried the faint scent of damp earth. As I walked toward Steve's house, my heart began to race. The street lights above flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move with me. My footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached Steve's porch, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorbell, but something held me back. The air felt too thick, too still. I almost turned around, but then the door opened, just slightly. A crack. Steve stood in the doorway, his face expressionless. His eyes were fixed on mine, cold and distant. It was as if he was waiting for me to say something, anything, but he didn't speak. He just stared. I tried to muster up the words, but they wouldn't come. I was frozen, caught in his gaze, feeling as if every part of me was being examined. Then, out of nowhere, the lights flickered. The hum of the streetlights above faltered and died, and for a brief moment, everything was plunged into darkness. I could feel the air thickening, pressing in on me from all sides. "Steve," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What's going on? What is this place?" He didn't respond. Instead, I heard a noise from inside the house. Something shuffling, faint footsteps on the floorboards. The sound seemed to be coming closer, but when I looked into the darkened hallway, I saw nothing. The door was still slightly ajar, but it wasn't enough to see anything beyond the threshold. "Steve," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Still no response, but I felt it, a presence, something behind me, just out of sight. It was as though the shadows were closing in on me. My mind was racing, every instinct telling me to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, as if some invisible force had wrapped itself around me. Suddenly, the door slammed shut in front of me. I jumped back, heart pounding. The house went completely silent again. My pulse raced, and I stared at the door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My breath was coming in short bursts, my hands trembling. I knew then that this wasn't just about a strange neighborhood. This was something bigger, something darker. I turned and hurried back to my house, my mind a whirlwind of panic and confusion. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I couldn't let it go on any longer. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before whatever was happening here swallowed me whole. When I reached my house, I immediately went to check the locks. I'd had enough of this place, of the whispers and the shadows. The house was supposed to be my safe haven, but it had become my prison. But when I reached the door, I froze. The lock was broken, the door wide open. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, staring at the empty space in front of me. How? I was sure I had locked it. There was no way the door could have opened on its own. But there it was, open. The air inside the house felt heavier now. The oppressive silence pressed in on me from all sides. The shadows were longer, darker. I stepped inside cautiously, heart in my throat. That's when I heard it, the tapping. But this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. I rushed upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was getting louder, faster, like someone was chasing me. But when I reached the top of the stairs, there was nothing there. No one, except for one thing. The door to my bedroom was ajar, and inside, standing perfectly still in the middle of the room, was the figure of a person. They were dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by the shadows. Their posture was rigid, as if they had been waiting for me. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were watching me. I could feel their gaze burning into me, even without the ability to see their eyes. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to leave, to run, but I was paralyzed. Couldn't look away. Couldn't move. Then, as if on cue, the figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. My mind screamed for me to react, to fight, to run, but my body refused. I watched in horror as they approached. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. The figure didn't respond, but it was clear now that they weren't going to stop. They were coming closer, and nothing I did could change that. I backed up slowly, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the lights flickered and went out. The house plunged into darkness. I could feel the presence of the figure, but I couldn't see them. The world was suddenly spinning. I didn't know where I was going. I had no control, but I had to act. I had to do something. I made a decision, a choice I knew might change everything. I don't remember much after the lights went out. I think I must have blacked out. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of my living room, drenched in cold sweat. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. My body ached, my head throbbed, and for a moment, I just laid there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't know how much time had passed. Could have been hours or mere minutes. But when I stood up, everything felt different. The house was still, too still. The oppressive silence that had enveloped me felt like it had been waiting for something, waiting for me to acknowledge it. The figure in my room was gone. The door was still ajar, but there was no sign of anyone, no trace of the person who had been standing there. I didn't know if I was relieved or terrified. I tried to tell myself it was over, that whatever had happened, it was just a figment of my imagination. Some twisted trick my mind had played on me under pressure. But deep down, I knew better. There was something I had seen, something I had felt, something real. I spent the next few days trying to push it all out of my mind. I kept myself busy, cleaning, organizing, trying to return to some semblance of normalcy. But it didn't work. The unease never left. It lingered in the corners of my thoughts, creeping in when I least expected it. Every time I passed the empty house next door, my heart would race. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the window. But there was nothing, no movement, just the same empty house. I couldn't shake the feeling that the neighbors were still there, behind the closed doors, in the shadows. And then there was Steve. I didn't see him again after that night. I didn't know if he had been real, or if I had imagined him. But I couldn't help but wonder if he had known all along what was going to happen. If he had been waiting for me to uncover something that wasn't meant to be found. I began to notice other things. Little things, like how the streetlights flickered at odd times, or how the walls of my house seemed to creak and groan when there was no wind. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing with me, sharing my anxiety. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone, that there was someone, still here watching, waiting. Every time I heard a knock at the door, my heart would stop. I'd freeze, my breath caught in my throat, waiting to see if someone was there. But every time it was nothing, just the silence. Yet, Deep inside, I knew it wasn't over. The mystery, the danger, it hadn't disappeared. It was still there, lingering, just out of reach, like a shadow in the corner of my vision. The worst part is the dreams. They come every night now. At first, I thought they were just nightmares, the aftermath of stress and fear. But the more I had them, the more I realized that they were more than that. They felt real. I could see the faces of the people who had been in the house next door, their eyes empty, vacant. They would stand there in the dark, watching me, and no matter how much I tried to wake up, I couldn't. The faces would follow me, their hollow gazes burning into me. I tried calling the police, but when they arrived, the house was empty. Not a single sign that anyone had ever lived there. No records, no neighbors. Just an abandoned, run-down property with overgrown weeds in the yard. They didn't believe me. They told me I had been under stress, that maybe I had been imagining things. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. And no matter how much I tried to explain it, I couldn't make them understand. Now I'm left with nothing but questions. What happened to the neighbors? Where did they go? What was that figure in my bedroom? Was it real? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? And what was Steve's role in all of this? I don't have answers. Maybe I never will. But I'm no longer the person I was before I moved here. That much I know for sure. The paranoia, the fear, it's always with me now. Every knock on the door, every flicker of the lights, every creak in the floorboards. It all feels like a warning, a reminder that something is out there, something I can't see, but I know is watching me. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of this place. The darkness has followed me, and no matter how far I run, I can still feel its presence, waiting, watching, and I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before it comes for me again. Ready for more chills and mysteries? Subscribe and turn on the bell. You never know what story is coming next.